This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Weather My Trains. Hey, are you like me and the thought of doing a DIY weathering job on an expensive engine leaves you in fear? It's time to call in Rob Arsenault at Weather My Trains. Do what thousands of satisfied customers have done and let Rob help you notch up the realism on your layout with beautifully detailed weathering on your locomotives and rolling stock. To see what Rob can do for you, check out his website at weathermytrains.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. On this episode, we're talking to John Doehring. John, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ray. How are you?
I'm doing great, John. Thanks for being here. Kind of a weird day today in New England. It's a little warmer than expected for April, so I'm sweating a little bit here in the Around the Layout studio, but hopefully it's nice and cool where you are and you're ready and settled in to have a nice chat about your railroading story here.
You bet. Yeah, it is a little warm today, but I'm not going to complain about it, or else we get the weather gods come right back in and give us some more.
That's right. Well,
more like winter, right?
Yeah, we would end up paying for. Hopefully we're beyond that. We had a nice, easy winter up here in New England. And one thing that did definitely help with was the Amherst show, where that was the first time I've actually got to meet you in person.
Yeah.
And what a great show that was with some really good weather. It
was fantastic. And I think in over the last 17 or 18 years, I've only missed that show twice. Once was the year before this last one, because I happened to be out of town and couldn't get back because of that snowstorm. But yeah, that's always kind of an anchor to the whole season. And the more you travel around the rest of the country, the more you really appreciate what we have right here in our own backyard.
That's right. So I know that you had some special stuff going on. Your role as the Eastern District Director of the NMRA. And Amherst was a pretty big event for the NMRA this year.
We were so super busy. We've always had a presence there, mostly at the region level, at the Northeastern region level, in cooperation generally with one or two of the divisions. But we've never had this kind of really explicit national presence. So this year we had the board meeting right before the show. We had the entire NMRA national board there, and then we had a whole bunch of department heads, and a lot of people think that the NMRA is a really big organization with lots of people in it. There are a lot of volunteers, and a whole bunch of them were there. And there were times when it was hard to get anybody else in the booth because we were all in it. But it was really cool. There was a lot of activity. We met and talked to lots of people. Lots of vendors, lots of customers, lots of members, all kinds of things. So yeah, it was fantastic. I hope we will continue to do something like that on a regular basis.
Absolutely. It was good to see that. And we're going to talk about your role with the NMRA a little bit later. But first, I want to get to know John Doehring, the modeler. So why don't we start with how you got started on this journey in model railroading?
Well, sure. I live in New England and have for about 20 years, but I'm not from here. I grew up in Texas. Houston, Texas is my hometown. So I spent the first half of my life down there. And when I was young, my parents were real beach bums. So as a family, we were often down at Galveston or Freeport Beach every weekend. And the significance of that is to get from Houston down to the coastline, you go through kind of petrochemical territory, if you will. A lot of chemical plants and oil refineries and things like that. So when I was really young, anywhere between 6 and 12, that's what my deep memories are of Southern Pacific Cotton Belt trains, black tank cars, gray hoppers, carrying all those petrochemical products and just lumbering around all the time. Freight trains were everywhere. And so I was really captured with that as a young boy. I started as a model railroader pestering my father to drive me all over town to hobby shops, probably when I was 11 or 12. somewhere in there. And I'm not quite old enough to be the sort of in the Lionel steam crowd, I think, but I had an early Tyco HO train that turned into a 4x8 in my bedroom that didn't get too much farther past the plywood plane stage, but I was totally into it, building Athearn kits when I was a young teenager, and just imagining all of that. Those are my early memories.
There seems to be, you kind of hit on something. You were saying that, maybe, the guys just grew up with Lionel trains, and then you have the Tyco. That seems like there's like a, an age gap, or maybe the line is drawn somewhere there between, were you in the Lionel era or were you in the Tyco era when you first start?
Well, I've noticed over time, that the people who are a little bit older than me, somewhere between 5 and 10 years older than me, often, it was more, so they would have been growing up in the early 60s instead of the late 60s and early 70s. And there were a lot more Lionel trains. A lot of those people have memories of actually getting a cab ride when they were 10 years old or something like that, right? Just by standing on the side of I sort of missed a little bit of that as the world was changing. But boy, I definitely was in love with that. I kind of laugh about it now, that Tyco train. It worked just fine. Yeah. And then when I think I was 12, when I met a fellow who was an adult model railroader, and I remember thinking at the time, there's actually like serious people in this, not just us kids.
Right.
Of course, I guess that at some level going to hobby shops, but meeting somebody, seeing their layout, and seeing what was possible beyond just nailing your track to a piece of plywood, kind of explodes your mind and takes you to a whole different level. And probably the most important part of that first meeting and that relationship was, and now, we're talking about 50 years ago for me. Yeah. This fellow had a stack of NMRA bulletins on his desk. He picked one up and he said, "You see this?" And we said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Someday you're going to be in this organization because this is where, the really serious model railroaders are." And so I was 12 and I was thinking, that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to be an MMR. And, I had absolutely no idea what any of that meant. But that whole idea that there's such a thing as a real model railroad or whatever that means, right? Not just a
for sure. Absolutely.
It means somebody like that. Impression on me really, really early.
Yeah, I was going to say that's really wild to meet somebody that, and somebody you can relate to that young, see what could be. What do you remember of his layout?
He had not much. Now that I think about it, at the time I was completely blown away, but I think this fellow lived like in a 2-bedroom apartment. So he probably had not a 4x8 sheet, but maybe 2 4x8 sheets and an L or something like that. And was probably a spaghetti bowl kind of over and under thing, sure. HO scale. So, in the grander scheme, it probably wasn't much further along than the kind of thing I was building, but it was the best I'd ever seen at that moment, So,
So 12 years old, and so what kind of changes did it influence you to make any changes at home? You were talking about this, 4x8 layout and whatnot. One
thing I do remember is I came home and started weathering my cars, which prior to that I had not done anything like that. So. And I still chuckle thinking about it. I think, I remember taking, brown and black paint and watering them down and running the brush across the top of it, and it would sort of drain down, and you go, "That's pretty good," and, but I don't know. I think we still have that. You still today see beautiful, beautiful layouts all over the place with brand new shiny cars. And, so it does take a little fortitude to mess them up, especially if you've paid $40 for each one of them or something.
Goodness, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
we talk about that on a past episode here with Rob Arsenault, who does this professionally, weather my trains, and even sending them to a professional can be fearful, let alone trying to do it yourself. But hey, you start at a young age, and you got somebody kind of guiding you a little bit, and you take that lesson home, and things you carry with you.
And I got to tell this one story that I share often about what's possible in the prototype. Once on a business trip, I was in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I heard the train whistle down the street. So I sort of ran from the hotel down to the tracks 3 or 4 blocks. Yep. And here comes a big CSX train headed east, and it is carrying 100 coal cars, which are empty and are brand spanking new.
Yeah.
And they're almost all 100 of them in numerical order. So,
that's wild. Yeah.
Yeah. So I took pictures of that and recorded a little video and said, next time somebody sees your shiny brand new train and say, that doesn't look very prototypical, show them this video, because anything's possible in the real. That train had to have come directly from the factory.
Yeah. If you can find it in the prototype, you can justify it. And yeah, they're all new at some point. That's right. So yeah. You hitting your teenage years, did you find yourself hitting that kind of that fall off that sometimes happens with teenage boys? Sure.
I mean, what really happened to me is, as I prepared to go to college, I did sort of put the trains aside a little bit as a late teenager in favor of driving a fancy Mustang around and doing all those kinds of things. But I didn't give it up totally. And as I was getting ready to go to college, I was going to be doing something that was a bit unique for me, kind of out of the norm. Instead of moving into a dorm as a freshman, I moved into an apartment with a close friend of mine who was an upperclassman. So, kind of the relevance of which meant we were going to be in an apartment, and I had a bedroom, and I had a little bit more room than I would in a dorm room. So I started thinking, well, what could I do, right? And right around that time, I found the Comback book that was about modeling the Clinchfield Railroad in N-scale.
Okay.
And that was a real transformational kind of thing. It's like I didn't know hardly anything about N-scale, but here was a layout that layout, I think, was, if I remember correctly, like 6x13 or something, but it was a real big railroad, a lot of stuff packed into a pretty small area. And so I started thinking, hey, I could get an N-scale layout in the corner of my bedroom.
Yeah.
And so I got out one of my trusty books, Lynn Westcott's 101 Track Plans. I've got a few dog-eared copies of that thing. I've been reading on and off for 50 years. Found a track plan, built some bench work that was about, say, 3x7, something like that.
Yep.
And that piece of bench work went no further, but I sat and stared at it through 3 years of college. I didn't get anywhere, but I did get somewhere, because at that point I sort of shifted my mindset and I became an N-scaler.
Yeah.
And perhaps there was a silver lining in that too, because N-scale was pretty rough in those days.
Yeah.
And all the people I know that built layouts, we're talking about the late 70s now.
Mm-hmm.
All the people that have been in N-scale. One fellow said this, I think, so accurately. He said, N-scale works fine as long as you're running the locomotive backwards at 100 miles an hour. And so I sort of missed actually operationally trying to figure a bunch of stuff out during that time period. But I mentally became an N-scaler. Of course, then after I graduated from college, then life really got away from me. I got married really quickly. I got a new job and a career. I got 3 kids, and then it was, you sort of snap your fingers and it's 20 years later.
So pretty much you were kind of out of the hobby, kind of dormant in the hobby for nearly 20 years. That's a long time to be away from it.
I can prove to you that I never let it go because I had this huge stack of model railroader magazines. You could see through the stack, that it would come in waves, and then there'd be 6 of them in a row, and then there wouldn't be anything for a couple of years, and then,
Yeah.
So I really, and I know we've all reflected on this over time. I've never stopped being a model railroader, whatever that means.
Right.
And I've always had that kind of dream, and I would sort of drift in and out and play around with it a little bit, or maybe build a kit. But I just never had the time or didn't feel like I did until, fast forward all the way to about 2001 or 2.
Okay.
I started working on in-track modules. And
what sparked that moment? Like, so you're 20 years. I mean, you have the magazines, you're kind of keeping the embers, hot by doing that. And but now it rekindles. And what was that point for you?
It's such a good question. And I don't know exactly the answer other than to say, I had this really deep identity of being a model railroader and building a layout and actually accomplishing it so that not doing anything is sort of not okay, right?
Yeah.
I mean, which is weird because other hobbies and sort of part-time pursuits sort of come and go in your life. And, I played golf for a number of years. I skied for a number of years, but, I don't think of those as being who I am. And so when it came time to let those go, because I didn't have time for them, that was not that big of a deal. But I can never really let this go. Maybe all the way back to being 12 years old and talking to an adult and kind of say, this is what I want to do someday. So I just kind of held on to it. I've always had trouble. I still do today because I'm a business consultant, sort of professional. I'm really into my career. I own my own little practice. So it's not just a job for me. It's sort of a professional identity. It's kind of what I do and what I love to do. So that's always competing for my time and energy.
Sure.
But I got to this place. And when we moved to New England, I started going to train shows and I think I started going to the big show in Springfield. And so I've been really close to it for a long time. And at some point, and I know it was as I was approaching my 50th birthday now, so late 40s, I started thinking, if I don't get going here, I'm not going to make it. And the big problem I have is I don't know how to do anything. I need the how kind of stuff. Yeah. And so I started to convince myself, and I've kidded about this a number of times over the years. I said, I didn't start joining organizations because I thought I needed more friends. For God's sakes, I'm kind of an introvert and, and shy, and I would never want to do, I didn't need any people, but I needed to kind of look underneath the modules and get help with this and figure out that. So I began to think, I'm not going to be able to get there on my own. I'm going to have to join with some other modelers so that I can sort of learn how to do this. And that's really what drove me to really up my participation, if you will.
Yeah. So where did that participation begin?
So I don't have a home layout. I didn't then, and I still don't. I've got one on the drawing board here, and I've got a beautiful basement for it. And so sure. I'm hoping in the next 2 years to be able to really break ground on that. But so kind of the compromise for me was, okay, I can't really focus on building a layout right now. And frankly, at the time, I wasn't thinking that small layouts, which I know you've covered some, I didn't think of those as quite the option that they are today. It was sort of all in or nothing. But my version of small layouts was to become a modular model railroader. And 15 years ago, that meant in-track, and that was sort of the where the two things come together, in-scale and modular railroading. So there's a local in-track club here in the Boston, Massachusetts area, Northeast In-Track. I started to hang out with those guys, and I helped them for a couple of years before it sort of dawned on me that a modular railroad club would be a lot more fun if I had modules.
Yep.
So, then it was time to build my own. And
let's take a step back, because we don't get often a chance to talk to N scalers. We've had a few on the show. Dean Ferris comes to mind quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But why don't you tell us about N-Track?
So it's, for those who don't know, one of the things really interesting is that, not a lot of people sort of instinctively think about N-scale at all, right? The hobby is dominated by HO, but N-scale is the second most popular scale. And I don't know the numbers, but I'm going to guess it's probably represents 20 to 30% of modelers, something in that range, maybe half of. So it's not insignificant. There's a lot of N-scalers.
Sure.
The N-scale played a really, really important role early on in bringing layouts out of the basement with the creation of these modular layouts. Now, if you're coming into the hobby today and you go to a train show, you're quite likely to see modular setups there in all kinds of different scales, right? From small to large. So that's become something you just sort of expect when you go to a train show, that there's going to be a lot of operating layouts. But N-Track really made that happen. It wasn't necessarily exactly the first, but certainly the first at scale that started building. So that goes back to 1974 and 1975, and there was a period, kind of a golden years in there, from about the mid 70s to the mid 90s, maybe even a little later in the 2000s, where N-Track was really, really a big deal, and huge layouts were getting built all over the place. And each year would bring somebody saying, we're going to build the biggest one ever. Mm-hmm. And so many N-scalers are modular oriented, even if they do have sort of home layouts. We learn construction techniques differently. We think about lightweight modules, things that are portable, and all of that. So, meanwhile, and kind of to my earlier comments about how N-scale was kind of rough in the early years, it evolved really, really quickly 20 years ago into much more operationally reliable, much better looking models, and on and on and on till today. Many of us who are N-scalers would argue it's pretty damn close to as good as it gets in terms of quality of operation and fidelity of models. It's a good scale to be involved in today, and it allows you to do things more prototypically because you've got so much more potential room.
It must have been exciting for you, starting an N-scale back when, and seeing where, it started, knowing where it started, and now taking it forward to where we are now with N-scale, and just how much it advances, kind of, helps motivate you to keep going because it's so much better.
Oh, yeah. It really is. We've had a couple of sort of really big breakthroughs that you can trace through time, but I would kind of liken it to how it probably was in HO and maybe in the 30s and 40s or something, right? That especially operational reliability. And today, there are lots of modelers that are in N-scale and are big into operations, and it works just fine. I led a panel on one of the virtual conventions a couple of years ago, operations and N-scale, and I had 3 panelists, and they all had trouble with the basic foundation, the basic idea and theory of the panel, because their attitude was, there's really nothing to say here. It works just like it does in any other scale. And I was like, no, but we got to tell this story because people don't get that, right?
Right. So probably somebody from the HO. I'm from HO, and I can imagine, I'm sure that, there's got to be a little bit more delicate touch, but, it seems like the way I've seen N-scale run nowadays, it's solid, it's reliable, and very close.
Yeah,
very close.
I think it is a little bit more delicate putting things on. I still have trouble putting HO's cars on tracks and stuff.
Sure.
The only challenge I find in operations is, it's hard to read the numbers on the car. So there's different couple of ways you can kind of hack that. But short of that, and the neat thing about N-Track, now the downside of N-Track, which has led to kind of other ways of thinking about modular railroading, is it draws a whole range of people and interest level and skill level and you might have a world-class modeler, and his module will end up next to a tornado, or
Yeah.
or a dinosaur module, and
Sure.
you just have to sort of roll with the punches, because it's supposed to be participatory and inclusory. The great thing about it is, for somebody without a layout in particular, but even if you had a home layout, you're rarely are you ever in a situation where you can run, a 100-car train. And I have about 10 100-car trains just because,
Yeah.
just because that's what you can do with one of those modular setups, is you bring a really, really long train of, coal cars or auto racks or something, and just blow everybody away. And I've always enjoyed putting on that show for the public.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said. We say it quite often on the show. We talk about, either modulars or clubs, or a combination of the two. If it's a modular club, or even if they don't have maybe they have a stationary layout in a building somewhere. There is, you get a variety of different modelers at different levels and different skill sets. But the amazing part is that you get to connect with these people, as you mentioned. You're talking about being an introvert, and now you're out. Your work is being put next to somebody who's potentially better than you, or somebody that's potentially not as good as yours, but you all get to work together and kind of bring each other up in the lift a little bit.
I learned tons. I'm not as active today in Intract, and haven't been for a few years now, but that's really where I learned how to build my first module. I learned what little I know about electronics and DCC and things like that. And just, and just going through this process that every model railroader who gets anywhere knows, which is, as one of my friends said, he said, never forget that the second time you do this, you won't be 15% better. You'll be 1,000% better. And as a result, you'll probably throw away what you started with. So stop worrying about it and just do it. Right. And it was I think, I fret on everything, and I stall, and I don't do anything because I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up. And it's like, every time I hear that, my buddy who passed away is now, it started ringing in my ear. It's like, just get on with it. Just build the thing, because you're going to get so much better through the process that you're going to probably start over anyway, and tear it all out and do it all over again. And that was really good advice, right? You just can't hurt anybody.
That's outstanding advice. I think sometimes we get that, you get kind of that, analysis paralysis kind of thing. And then you get, where you're, I think of Dave Ramsey, one of the guys I like and listen to, and he talks about that ready, aim, pull the trigger, go, just pull the trigger and do it. And there's so many people that just sit there and aiming, and they never get their finger on the trigger to go. And it's great to have people like that that can give you some great advice and motivate you to just get started. Because the worst that can happen is you tear it up and you start over.
That's what happens.
Really not that big of a deal, but a lot of people have a hesitation to do that.
Well, this idea too, that not only is that the worst, not just that might be the worst thing that can happen, but that's actually the thing you want to happen in a way, right? It's like, because the reason why you tear it up and start it over if you didn't make a mistake is that you realize you're better now than you were last year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago when you thought this was. And that has just come back over and over to me. It's just like, there's nothing wrong here. It's just evolved, and now I want to do this. I think I could do better in a second shot. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm actually building a set of sort of, I call them 2.0s, kind of new Intract modules, based on what I learned playing around with it for the first 5 years. Another fellow I know said, never forget about modular railroading. He said, never forget that a module is a model railroad layout that goes for a car ride.
Yeah.
And that's pretty profound, because it gets beat the heck out of it in ways that make you then look at it and say, well, maybe next time I won't put 152 custom trees on my module that ended up upside down out on the driveway with all those trees smushed. Okay, that's a lesson learned.
Yeah. Sometimes, education's expensive, right?
Right.
And that's the tuition right there. All those great trees you spend so much time on. You learn.
Yep.
I want to make a point too about the modular layouts. You're talking about that, and I've seen quite a bit of that, and it seems to be kind of a revolution in our hobby, regardless of the scale of this. Either modular or the term shelf layout, and the revolution it's taken. And I'm not sure what the time period is, but I certainly know it's seemingly going on right now, of people looking at the hobby completely differently.
Absolutely.
Saying I don't need my entire basement, and I don't need to really make my wife completely angry at me to get myself in the model railroading hobby, and the modular is all part of that as well.
I think I absolutely 100% agree with you. And I think there are two dimensions of that have impacted me. One is sort of a next step evolution for me and many others is getting involved in Fremo in-scale modular railroading. So
let's talk about that. Tell us about
that. So that's one thing, which is the idea that I can really aspire to a higher level of prototype and higher fidelity modeling and still be in modules. So that, to your point, that's one of the things. Yeah. It's like, okay, I don't need a big basement layout. I can build a set of Fremo modules, and the sky's the kind of limit in terms of how good I can aspire that to be. And also I'm going to be with a group that has that kind of ethic, not to diminish the other. And one of the cool things about InScale is that we have not 2, but 3 options, because we have T-Track also. Mm-hmm. Each one of them kind of attracts a certain way of doing things and a way to enjoy the hobby. And I like playing in all of them. But so that's one thing. The other thing that kind of comes at it from the different direction for me is getting involved in operations, which is really my sort of fun thing. That's kind of my thing and what I really love doing. Almost every time I operate on somebody's railroad, I come home with this same kind of head blowing thing that I just spent 3 hours focusing on an 8-foot long yard, yep. Or switching this one paper mill that is really only was 3x6 or so, so right. Many times I've had that. And I found over time, I really like the smaller layouts that are done really well rather than the huge sprawling basement empires that are kind of by definition going to be half finished because they're such big projects, So those two things together are always recasting my eye towards do something smaller and do it well and enjoy it and then see what happens. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It is amazing. I'm an owner of a small layout, and I know several others, and you go to those, and the operations, again, the only thing really you're missing is the long running, but all the switching actions there. And if you're an operations guy, you can 1, 2 industries on there, 3. It doesn't take very much. And what I love is it's just another entry point into this great hobby that you don't have to, you can think differently, and it doesn't take. We got my executive producer, Paul Kassar. He built his on industrial steel shelving. You don't even have to really, he's got, I'm not saying that Paul doesn't have carpentry skills, but you don't have to have necessarily the best carpentry skills. You can build it on something that's, pre-built or bought at a store or a Home Depot of sorts, and still find a way to get yourself into the hobby. It's really, really a great entry point to get more people involved.
I agree with you 100%. And it's so much different. When I was a kid, and I had that book, 101 track plans for model railroaders. That book starts out with some really small layouts, and then a huge thick part of that is sort of what to do on a 4x8 sheet of plywood, which was kind of the ethic back in those days. But you creep your way through that book and those plans until the very last page of that book is "If I Had $1 million." And so even when I was a young kid, I'd be staring at big room-sized thing with CTC control up above it.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like, oh, that's what I want to have, Yeah. And I think that was kind of wrong in that way, or at least wrong for me, because it constantly pushed you past what you could actually realistically do. And so,
Right.
the layout I want to build in my basement's actually pretty good size. But what I really have in plans is a large switching layout.
Yeah.
Basically a lot of activity. So that's what I love to do. And so I'm really encouraged by that. And I think more people should be,
Do you remember your first introduction to operations, where you first
100% do.
Tell us about it.
So the other thing that happened to me around the time that I joined InTrack was that I joined the NMRA and started participating in the local division, which is the hub division for me, the greater Boston, Massachusetts area.
Yep.
And, sometimes you hear people talking about, well, I went to a division meeting or two and it just wasn't my thing, or the guys weren't very friendly, or, I couldn't fit in, or something like that. It wasn't easy for me either, going to a place where there were a lot of strangers. Sure. I had to it was back to that mindset of, I've got to figure out how to meet these people, because they're the ones that can help me figure out how to build these modules and enjoy this hobby. So I was really motivated, and it took a while, but eventually a couple people kind of started paying attention to me and asked me to volunteer here or there. One fellow in particular who was in charge of membership, which meant before too long I was being roped into standing at one of those tables at train shows, trying to get new members. But this fellow, John Lutz, who's also passed on, was just really, really good about certain things. And one of the things he had was this idea that we should do this operations for beginners program, sort of make it available. And he found three of our layout owners here in Massachusetts area that would be willing to host a session for beginners. And I went to one of those, Carl Simpsonbaum's Atlantic Shoals Railroad.
Yeah.
And almost just like what I was saying a minute ago, the very first time I did that, Carl put me on a kind of a minor yard on sort of a branch line, so that I ended up over in a corner of the basement all by myself for 3 hours, switching cars. Never had done anything like that. And I walked out of there just like on cloud nine, calling my wife on the phone saying, "You're not going to believe this. This is so much fun." And I couldn't explain it to her. It's like, she was like, "Well, it sounds like you're just playing with trains." And I was like, it's not it, it's not it. Fast forward a couple of years, and my wife called me when I was on a session one night, operating a big busy yard, and my wife calls me with something important. I said, "Honey, I can't talk to you right now. I've got 2 westbounds coming in. I got to get this so-and-so out." She's like, "Oh, forget it." The house is on fire, but I'm sorry. I've got work to do here. But
don't call me. Call 911. I'm busy.
It was just transformational. And I know some of your other guests have talked about how operations really changed kind of how you think about the hobby. But for me, it was, I'm quite certain, Ray, that if I hadn't gotten involved in operations, there would have been a risk that I learned enough to get bored. After all these years of dreaming about it, you start building something and it goes around a couple of times and you go, okay, that's done.
Yeah, I always try to tread lightly, because I know there's people that are probably listening right now who have a 4x8 or whatever the size may be, and the trains go around and they're very happy, and that's awesome. I know me personally, I was building that and I was enjoying that for a while, but when you start to have a railroad that has a purpose, and that's kind of what you were doing, you've got customers to deliver product to, you're moving commodity, you're, in your head. And when you feel that you're doing something other than just watching, you're a participant, and it adds a whole new dynamic to the hobby.
Yeah. It was a game changer for me. And I would say today that I've become one of those guys, sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum are, you answer the question, what would you rather have? A model railroad with 5 like beautifully built, scratch built structures, each of which took you a year and a half to make, and track that's not wired up yet. That's one end of it, or the other end, right? An operating model railroad going through a bunch of sort of cardboard mock-ups and signs taped to the plywood. And I'm with you. There's not a right way or a wrong way, and I enjoy seeing both of them. But I just love the operations part so much that's kind of the way I lean. But then to where you said about the small railroad, that's where you kind of be able to get a little bit of both of these things, right? You can kind of have operations, but also get it done to a level where it's more convincing.
And then you've got the best of both worlds kind of layouts, like Kyle LeBlanc, who we interviewed early on in the show, who has both. He's got all the operations, but he's also built it for continuous running. So he can either do one or the other. So you got, again, going back, you got to know what drives you and what inspire, what you want to be in the hobby. And to do that, try a whole bunch of different things.
Right. And that's
try different scales, go to somebody else, go to an N scale layout, go to an HO scale layout, go to an operating layout, try operations, get your hands on the throttle. Don't be afraid. But you're going to learn a lot about yourself through other people's layouts.
Boy, that's so true. And I was going to say, that's another super benefit of operating. And about a third of my operations experiences happen on one fellow's layout, Bruce Robinson, who lives in southern New Hampshire. And Bruce has kind of been my mentor and sort of taught me how to do things all the way up to, running all the different jobs at his layout, Valley Junction, and then eventually becoming a dispatcher and learning how to do that. So about a third of my experiences happened there. Another third of it happened at NMRA functions, mostly Northeastern region conventions, but also some couple of nationals, right? So that's been a benefit of the NMRA, is getting access to these other railroads. But the point of that being kind of like not just doing it in one place, but doing it in very different places, kind of reinforces what you said. It's like I've changed a lot in terms of understanding what it is I really like, what I want, what I don't need to have, what's super important, what isn't, as a result of seeing, not just walking in on a layout tour and seeing a bunch of different things, but actually watching them work and where they work well, where there's shortcomings. So that's another, you have to, for me, I had to get over this hump of joining in with other people that wasn't kind of natural to me, joining in and doing that. But then once you get on the other side of that and you're kind of in the family, so to speak, then you kind of get these opportunities pop up and you sort of get invited to this and that, and you see all these different things. And that's been just a tremendous upside that I wasn't expecting,
In the beginning of the show, you and I, we mentioned one of my favorite books, and you mentioned as well, Jim Collins' Good to Great. And I'm thinking about the pivot point from good to great. And, in that pre-show chat, what was the good to great pivot for you for your NMRA journey? Where was that big pivot point where you joined the hub and kind of reeled in, but then you really start to.
Well, what happened to me was like I said, I joined Intrac and I joined the NMRA because I wanted to learn how to do things.
Right.
I started getting involved at the hub level in a real light way, membership table, missions table, supporting various different things at train shows. One year I had to jump into a Santa costume because Santa got sick, So I did a bunch of different kind of things. But really, most of it was sort of not super involved. And then one day I saw an ad in the Northeastern Region newsletter, which is called The Coupler, and they were looking for an editor. And I thought, well, I don't have any editorial experience, but I'm a writer in my work.
Yep.
Maybe I can sort of swing that and convince them. I was so naive to think that I was going to have to like qualify for this job.
Right.
But I raised up my hand. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anything about anything. And of course, it turns out, all you needed to be was a volunteer with a little bit of, a heart that's barely beating, and you qualified for the job. So I became the editor of the Coupler newsletter, which I did for almost 5 years. And it turned out that was an extraordinarily good job to have because I got access to all the other divisions in the region. And when you're a newsletter editor, not only that, but you've got like press credentials, right? You've got a reason to be calling people up. Right. I might have been in that job. I might have said, well, I've got to call this guy Ray and do a story on podcasting. And that would have been so much harder without that role. So over a period of those 4 years, I got to know so many more people outside of my division. And now all of a sudden I was sort of in that crowd. It led me to think, well, maybe I should run for the region board of directors. I have no idea why. It just seemed kind of like the next thing to do.
Sure.
Around that same time, I was also encouraged by some people in the hub division to run for the board there. And so one year I ran for the board of directors in my division and in the region, thinking I probably won't get, I might get one of them, but I won't get both of them. And I might not get either one of them. And it turns out, some people who are in the NMRA will listen to this and think, well, that doesn't make any sense. But the hub is a big division, and most of the races are competitive. And, and so running for the board is not just sort of a raise your hand and you're on it, So I thought my chances were kind of low, but turned out that year that some of the incumbents decided not to rerun and such. And, I wasn't expecting it, but I got elected to both at the same time. And even worse, if you will, the region people said, instead of running for one of the director jobs, can we slide you over to vice president, because we don't have anybody in that slot, and we got a couple of other people and they said, that's basically the same thing, right? Okay, so I did that. So this has become a John Doehring joke. A lot of people know that I've told this joke, and they know this is a part of my story. There is a difference between being an area director and being the vice president in one key situation, and that is what happens if the president of your region resigns. And that's what happened. A year into my service, the president of the Northeastern region had to step down for personal reasons. So suddenly, battlefield promotion, I'm now the president of the region. And so in a matter of a few years, I've gone from like nobody standing in the back of the room trying not to get too much attention to serving on 2 levels of boards, being a newsletter editor, and now I'm the president.
Yeah, you're very much in the front of the room now.
Yes, in the front of the room. And I had a strong personal feeling that not enough was happening at the region level, and that there was lots and lots of opportunity for us. So I asked the board if they wouldn't kind of lean into it and work on making the NER a much more valuable place. It turns out that all of those people on the board and all of the people running the various different departments kind of agreed with that and had a hankering for doing something too. We had extra board meetings for 3 years. I said, let's have these extra, we'll have a more aggressive cycle until we run out of things to do. It took us about 3 years before we started going, we're kind of getting caught up here. But there was just so much to do, and there always is. But anyway, right. So that's how I went from kind of not involvement to a lot of involvement. Now, along the way, what was motivating me a lot too was, well, I'm thinking about this NMRA thing, about the MMR, the achievement program, about, I'm getting volunteer hours here. I'm now getting, the chance to sort of run as an officer. And so that's the association official certificate. And so, that I wasn't being this completely selfless about this too. It was kind of a plan here to help me get those things kind of done as well. And yet I I look back now and say, well, look, I joined all this to help me learn how to build a model railroad, and I've spent all 80% of my energy in the last decade working on administration.
Yeah. So yeah, you kind of went from that to but involvement, and somebody's got to step up and do it. You certainly stepped up and did it. And what would you say within your tenure? What was some of the bigger accomplishments that you had within the Northeast region?
Well, so the biggest accomplishment is to not be able to appoint. I think the biggest personal accomplishment for me is to not be able to point to personal accomplishments.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
The best thing that we've done is build a team of people who are mostly doing the hard work. I'm thinking about newsletter editors. I'm thinking about people that run the convention program. People there's so many. I hate to put myself in that crowd because there's so many people that do so much, and the nuts and bolts behind it are, there's just a whole nother level of volunteer commitment. I sort of show up and stand in front of the room and wave my arms and say things. And, it's just like, that's the light part of it, running all the behind the scenes. And so but there are some things. We put together a strategic plan, which helped us to kind of think about how everything fits together and what we're trying to do. In 2015, around the time I took over, the prior year, we did not have a regional convention because we couldn't get anybody to sort of step up and do that. And I think it might have been the only time in the 75-year history of the Northeastern region where there wasn't a convention. I thought that was just not acceptable. So building not only a team to do that, but then a committed, sort of movement across the region and a pipeline of conventions. And it's an ongoing struggle. You live through one in your division, in the nutmeg division. And, it takes a group of 15 or 20 people putting on a whole lot of extra time to make that happen. So that I think is an important thing. So there are a bunch of different things like that, but another thing is just holding it all together through the pandemic. Much as we give Gordy and the team that he put together super credit for creating NMRAX, the Northeastern region really adopted that early on and created our own annual virtual convention, NERX, and I think we're either the only region or one of the only regions that's kind of still doing that. And that's a lot of work, putting all that together. So those are the things I'm proud of. We always had a bunch, we have sort of half the divisions are real robust and can take care of themselves, and the other half are kind of always like on the verge of falling apart and very fragile. So we try to do what we can to breathe into those and help them and support them. That's all a work in progress, but lots of things like that.
Yeah, it's no different than any other organization that's out there. It's about the people and getting the right people and in the right seat on the bus, and some divisions struggle more than others to get that to happen. But it's about the right person. It's about the right people.
It really is.
That have the right vision and can understand it. But for you and your role, I know you've kind of now you find yourself on the national board of directors, and talk about your role now as the Eastern District Director and the things that are on your agenda.
Yeah. Well, I'm 2 years into that to a 3-year term. Once again, it was just a matter of kind of being in a place, and people started saying, "Okay, that's the next step for you. You've been a region president for 6 years now." Wasn't quite ready to give that up yet, but the same thing. Looking at the national level and thinking about all the things that could be better. And back to our conversation before we started, I'm a management consultant. I work with organizations that are very successful and often at the top of their industry kind of places, and yet looking for good to great, looking for next level. So, I tend to look at situations and think, well, there's a lot more we could do here. Right. And NMRA National is like that. The other thing that happened is that Gordie Robinson was going to run for president. I knew that he had a really strong kind of change-minded agenda. So that was very also encouraging. I didn't want to join a board, and sort of be the only one sitting at the table that wanted to do anything differently. That seemed too much like work. Yeah. Sounds
too much like banging your head against the concrete wall at times too.
I mean, it's hard enough when everybody wants to do it. It's hard enough to actually figure out how to do it. So,
right.
So that was all an encouragement to jump in, and I did. And it has been a whirlwind and eye-opening experience. There is an awful lot of talent at that level, particularly beyond the board into the people that run the various departments. And I think there are lots of them, I mean, I don't think people really understand that, like I think last I heard, there's about 75 people, all volunteers, that work in standards and conformance,
Wow.
Meanwhile, there's certain people, there's an attitude out there that you'll hear every once in a while. It's like, oh, I didn't even know the NMRA was still involved in that. Haven't all the standards already been created, No. Well, no, because it's a super dynamic environment. So there's, I don't know what the number is, but I'd guess there's 125 people or something like that working in all the different areas, from IT to marketing to conventions and all this kind of thing. So it's just a big scaled up version of the region. And so much to do. It's really easy to sit around the table and think, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had this or we had that? But somebody's got to pick it up and get it done.
Right.
And so I'm the Eastern District Director, which means I'm one of 9 board members, 8 of which are 6 of which are assigned to specific regions. I essentially have the eastern third of the United States.
Okay.
So 6 of those directors are like that. There are 2 at-large directors. One is at-large North American, and the other one's sort of at-large rest of the world. And then there's a director who is responsible for liaison with the region president. So region advisory council is what that's called. Now, we do have these kind of geographic territories, if you will, but actually we function that just so we can have sort of nominally pay attention to what's going on in our area, and kind of take the lead to make sure that we have some sense of what's going on there. But in actuality, we all think of and vote and represent the corporation, as a whole, right? We don't.
Sure.
It's not like the U.S. Congress where my job is to only, sort of represent my constituents, if you will.
Sure.
But instead to be more global. But anyway, that's what it means. So I'm one of 9 there, and with 4 officers, we get together every single month. We have an action agenda, a list of special projects or things that we're trying to help departments with, and I've gotten involved in a couple of those that weren't on my radar screen that kind of got assigned to me. And then I've also got involved in a couple that are really passion plays for me. So I'm pretty excited about that, and I'm pretty busy.
I bet. And it's really kind of an exciting time. I mean, it's no secret that, the NMRA has really seen some positive changes over the last few years. It seems to kind of be, I think the whole hobby's evolving anyway, but the NMRA is starting to evolve along with it, and I'm the first to put somebody to rest when they say, the hobby's dying. It's not dying, it's evolving. And so is the NMRA. And, seeing that through new leadership, including yourself. What do you think some of the opportunities are for the NMRA, for that continued growth and involvement?
Well, That's a really good question that can unpack and go in a bunch of different ways. But if we just start sort of generally speaking,
Yeah.
the number one thing I think that we need to do and want to do and are focused on is short term is increasing the value that we're delivering to members. There's two ways that you could do that. Sort of conceptually, two ways you could do that. You could either pile on more value and services and stuff for your dollar spent, or you could reduce the amount that it costs to do that, to be a member. And we're sort of working on both edges of that, but just cutting cost and cutting membership dues is sort of a death spiral in a way. You take out something and then you can't support what you had in the past, and sort of, so we're really working to create new value. Now, one of the things that Gordy says a lot, and it's really, really important to kind of slow down and think about that, is we want to hold on to all of the value we're delivering already whilst making changes that will lead to more value. And that's more profound than it sounds. It's like we don't, while we're sitting here kind of breaking things and reinventing them and re-engineering everything, we don't want to mess up what we do have, because there is a lot of value there. And so that takes a lot of thinking. So partly it's just protect what you got that people care about, and then start thinking about how do we build around that.
You're dancing around one of my very favorite sayings.
Oh,
price is only an issue in the absence of value.
Yeah. I believe that really strongly. When people start to understand what the value is of the NMRA, then the price objection starts to go away, because they understand where their money is going, what it means to have that card in my pocket. And sometimes even I kind of struggle to explain why the card is in my pocket. And I think that's one thing that you guys are starting to aim towards, is why do you have that card in your pocket and you're walking around, or why should you have that membership in this organization? No question. And one of the things we talk about a lot is that a lot of that value is second and third order implications. It's, it's not the thing you think it is. Like for instance, I joined the NMRA, as I've said a couple times here, because I wanted to learn how to do something, not because I wanted more friends. But over the long haul, looking back, you say, is actually the friends have been way more valuable than the learning how to do something. But that's kind of a hard sell. It's like, I didn't join because I wanted to build my network per se. But here's how that impacts me today. And I was looking at the podcast website right before he came on, and I started going down the list, like, I know that guy, I know that guy, I know that guy. I was in Chris Atkins' house this week. He lives in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas. And why? Well, there's a long story behind that, but basically the connections and the people I've made through all of this has put me in all these sorts of places with friends all over. And so anyway, there's a lot that we're doing. We have some real specific goals. Turning around a long-term slide in membership is a big issue that we're working on. And this year, finally, we're seeing we've sort of slowed that down to a point where we had a year that was pretty flat. That's good, relatively good.
Good. There's just so many more model railroaders out there. I was driving today, coming back through town, and I look to the right, and there's a driveway with a cross bucks and lights on the driveway. I'd never seen it before, and I so badly want to pull down the guy's driveway and find out what he's up to. Right? It's like he's got to be one of us, right? Or she, right? I should assume he or she is one of us. How do we? And I'm quite often on the podcast, I'll say that it's okay to be a lone wolf, but boy, the world opens up to you if you can just come up the basement stairs and just talk to one person. And it's amazing. The 6 degrees of separation will start to tie you in with some really cool things.
Right. So one area where I'm trying to try to match up my personal passion for this hobby with my professional skills and my work is helping the organization to create a more real and motivating vision for what's possible. Right. Kind of really articulate what that is. And then how do we actually work to make that happen? There's so many things that are going on. By the way, there's a lot of things that are going on to improve the NMRA today, which are kind of hidden because they're not very sexy. Like here's an example. It's we want to really change the member experience. That's things like how easy is it to renew your membership? How easy is it to get information on the website or to contact somebody and get a problem solved? All those kinds of things, right? Someday we're going to get to the point where you're working on the piece of that, someday soon, I hope, where people see the change and they go, wow, that's really great. But the first step often is working on the foundational stuff, changing the website, changing databases, changing the infrastructure of the whole association. So there's a whole lot of that kind of work that's kind of getting done kind of on the foundation level right now. And that's sort of just a slog through enemy territory to get a lot of that non-shiny stuff done so that we can build a better association on top of that. But we're making a lot of good progress in that area. So I'm working on this vision thing. I have a clinic that I'm giving multiple times this year, and we'll record a video of it here as well, that really gets at how I think modelers need to rethink how they see the hobby in a way that would change our culture. So, because I think one of the things that's happened is that, well, it's just, there's a certain way that you need to act with each other, I think, culturally. To be more supportive. It's very, very easy in this hobby to be negative about other people. And you see the threads on social media kind of spiral out of control really, really quickly sometimes. Right. Well, I think we need to have a more heart-to-heart conversation with each other about the kind of culture that we want to build together. Because ultimately, Ray, I think, I agree with you. It's like if there are gazillions of model railroaders out there and we have a really, really small subset of them in this association, then obviously we're missing something. And what I go back to is think about me as that 12-year-old. Yeah. A fellow said to me, someday you're going to be a member of the NMRA. You know why? Because it's important, because it's relevant, because that's going to put you in the tribe that you want to be in. And I just believed that. So I get to be an adult. It's like, you don't have to sell me. I don't think about what my membership dues are. And I respect the people who do, right? But it's like, I want that. I think what we're trying to do is get the NMRA back into the center of just the identity of being a model railroader. It's never been for everybody. Sure. But for more people to go, well, of course I'm a member because I get this and this and this, and I get all these intangible benefits, and I get to hang out with all my friends.
Yeah. Again, it's all about being relatable to a large amount of people and understanding the value. There is a value of having a national organization that maintains the standards. There's a importance of having a national organization that, again, like you said, becomes a pivot point for the whole hobby kind of thing, where it's the hub, right? It's the hub of the whole thing. So,
but just think too about all the things we've talked about tonight. This is where I went and learned how to lay track. This is where I went and got exposed to operations, and then got actually into 25 or 30 or 50 other basements, however much it's been by now, right? These are the people I go see when I'm on a business trip, and the first thing I think of is, I'm going to be in Portland, Oregon next week. Who should I ring up? And all of that has fundamentally changed my entire experience in this hobby. And I'm deeply aspirationally hopeful that we're going to be able to convince 100,000 more people to sign up and be a part of that with us.
Again, the hobby is so much better shared, and when you have a platform that allows you to share it, that's certainly phenomenal.
Yeah.
So we're gonna wrap things up here. We've gone an hour, and we probably could go another few hours talking about the NMRA and your journey. But want to thank you for being on the show, and look forward to seeing the changes that are coming to the NMRA and what you're going to be doing, and then eventually seeing what you're going to be able to put together for your own layout here in the next couple of years.
Yep. I'll send you a picture or two. I'm working on a Fremo N-scale layout, and there's a lot more we can talk about with that too. So you can see that I've actually got, I'm getting my hands dirty a little bit here.
Well, that's good. So again, thanks for being on the show.
All right. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Around the Layout. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at patreon.com/Around the Layout podcast. Past episodes and more can be found on our website, aroundthelayout.com. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.